Welcome to the SIWIKE podcast, the only podcast that shares the stuff you didn't know you needed to know about jobs, careers, and life. The SIWIKE podcast, the stuff I wish I knew earlier.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the SIWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier podcast. We're here with one of our guest hosts, Michael Fearon, who comes to us with an interesting background in kind of disaster management, in teaching. He's in learning development, and he's also an Army reservist. And I'd love if you shared in your own words, like, what are you doing now? And then we'll get into the backstory of how you got there.
Okay. Well, right now I'm with the Ministry of Labor. I'm doing learning and development, and what that means is it's a lot of corporate learning and development, and it involves developing learning material and learning modules. We get to play with stuff like Premiere and doing video editing. At the same time, we do Captivate just to do general e-learnings and talking to corporate stakeholders. But when I'm not there in my free time, or like what I like to call it, time away, I teach at Ryerson University still in disaster management. And twice a week, I work with the Canadian Armed Forces as a reservist.
That's awesome. So if we can go back a little bit in time and talk to us about Michael as a kid. What were you like growing up? Were there any kind of early fond memories, or how were some of the influence along the way that kind of got you to where you are?
Well, I would have to say, as a kid, the biggest influence was definitely the discovery of dinosaurs. Okay. I'm pretty sure around 30 years old, that is where it's at. It was knowing all of them and knowing what they were like in their environment and discovering that. I was generally extremely quiet. I loved playing with Lego. I love building stuff, and I love just trying to discover and learn things. And that pretty much, I think, was the driving force for later that I didn't realize yet at that time. But if you told me something to do back then, it'd be build Lego or watch the Discovery Channel. Those were the things that definitely wanted to do.
That's awesome. So can you remember like your favorite dinosaur, the most kind of obscure one that you know?
Just the Velociraptor has to be, is always good way to go. Definitely.
And is that because of Jurassic Park, or is there some other influence on that, or?
No, not really because of Jurassic Park, actually. It was when I discovered Jurassic Park, dinosaurs or velociraptors were much more closer to Deinonychuses, and I discovered that raptors were smaller and had feathers about the size of a chicken. Sure. At that point, I was like, so I can get this as a pet, right? It's about dog size.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much how that got.
Yeah, they could roam around in your house, but it's a pretty vicious pet, I would imagine. But
yeah, I didn't think that far, but as a kid, you always think that the dinosaurs are going to be friendly.
Cool. So you were a bit of a quiet kid. You love learning, the Discovery Channel, Lego, and things like that. And then what were some of the influences along the way that kind of pointed you to things like teaching, things like disaster management?
Actually, oddly enough, what pointed me towards teaching was actually things that I couldn't do, more so than things that I could do, which is an odd way to go. But fun fact, I'm dyslexic, extremely dyslexic. So reading text is not exactly a fun suit. And as a kid growing up, that was a struggle, constant struggle. By grade 2, teacher at that time pretty much told my parents, he might not learn how to read in the future, so might have to find alternatives. And pretty much, even though I was a horrible writer, horrible reader, I have an amazing retention for facts and knowledge. And as I went forward, I discovered that maybe that would be something good to go for. I could present on things, and that would be the direction that I went towards. So I started being focused on teaching to figure out how to help other kids like myself. And that really drove me into the direction of going into teaching, becoming a camp counselor in underprivileged neighborhoods, really trying to find a way for a lot of the beginning part of my career, or a beginning part of my journey, to find a way to help other people like myself.
That's interesting. So I didn't know that about you. And I don't know if you're willing to share, but like, what is it like as a dyslexic to try to read something? So for me, I mean, I see words on the page and it comes fairly easily, but can you even describe that feeling? It seems totally different to me.
So it's different over time, I would say. And I feel it's as you get used to it, is the way I describe it. When I first started off reading, it was like words are dancing on the page. It's just letters are just like waves across the page. And as time goes on, I found it much more difficult on very specific letters. So P's and Q's, B's and D's, any shape that was similar, that when you flipped the other way is a completely different letter. So for the longest time, lowercase b's and lowercase d's looked the same to me. So by high school, I started changing how I wrote b's. So I used the cursive B because it was a completely different loop symbol and didn't have the full closure. So it looked different. But even to today, it still happens. The other thing I'd say is for me, everybody's experience is different. I tended to memorize words because breaking them down into phonetic sounds didn't make sense to me until a lot later on that I realized, letters make individual sounds and have individual meanings. You'd think you learned this earlier, but this is part of the challenge of learning disabilities. You kind of, it's its own discovery game of trying to figure out what works for you and what tool works for you.
Cool. Did you ever have like an aha moment where, okay, now this worked, or was there a specific like tool set that really helped you? You mentioned like the cursive B, which I think is quite ingenious actually to make it look totally different. But
pretty much, that was the main moments. Pretty much, I was just going like, okay, what will work? And you throw past at the wall and you figure out what works. And I think there was a book called much later on. By this point, I figured out how to read properly, or close to. I wouldn't say I've got to be proper at it. It was Stories of the Giant Squid, and it was a book on, and I think that's the correct title. I might correct it if I double check.
Sure.
But pretty much the book's entire idea was looking at how learning disabilities affect people. And that was actually the first book that I read that helped me realize that words were made of individual sounds, like Lego blocks. And once I understood that, I started actually improving drastically because it kind of connected to like, you can build things with your words.
That's amazing.
Sounds.
So it sounds like reading is one of those skills where a lot of us take for granted because it's easy. But if you have things like them dancing around the page or whatever, it makes it a little bit more challenging. And there are ways to cope with it, to adjust to it, and get better at it. So for those that are struggling with things like dyslexia, then there's hope, and then you can even become a teacher if you want.
You can pretty much do anything. You just have to learn your way of dealing with it and explore options, and you'll find a way to cope and actually excel and be great.
Cool. And I'm curious about like the whole mindset aspect of it, because once you're kind of labeled as dyslexic, as learning disabled, it's quite challenging for young children and stuff. Were you of the mindset where you're a bit more positive and more kind of on that side of the spectrum, or you were a little bit more, this is actually something that I'm having trouble with, and it brings me down a little bit?
You know what? A little bit of all of them. And you have your moments. So I know back in the day, a long time ago in grade school, about in grade 4 or 5, that's when I was going through the assessment process. So I ended up going to OISE a lot of times to be assessed, to figure out what's going on or what's happening or why is, pretty much it's like the mechanic shop for your reading and brain is how I like to think about it. It's not fun. I wouldn't recommend it as a fun thing to do. But at that point, I don't even think I comprehended the idea that there was something seriously wrong with me. It just kind of exists within your world. And the only time that you feel that something's really wrong is when you do that horrible exercise where they go around the classroom and everybody reads a line of the book.
Gotcha.
And you start going like, oh, sweet God, I don't understand. I don't know what to say. And you start trying to do math games to guess when it's your turn and how many lines somebody's going to read so that you can memorize that line before you have to say it.
Right.
And pray that you read enough before. So you have moments of being, maybe I'm special because I have mutant skills. And then other moments of just being, just aside from the rest of the world. And you kind of exist in these two realms of just going between moments of like, man, I got through that word today. I got this. I'm special. I'm great. To the other side of being like, oh no, you're not even on the playing field of the skill or ability. So I think you get to cope with both. And I think in coping with both, you find that your own inner strength in it, and you find your own story in it, and you find a way to actually succeed in a lot of environments just because you're not afraid of that embarrassment in one sense. And on the other side, you came up with all these ingenious ways to cope. So you get a nice mixed bag. I wouldn't say it's a great way to go always, because, it's challenging and can be traumatic. But at the same time, I do see the positives that come out of it.
Right. I'm reminded of a quote, something to the effect of like, oftentimes you learn more from your failures and your embarrassments than your successes, right? So it kind of speaks to me. And were there a lot of folks around you that kind of supported you in that, or was this kind of like a, you know what, it's all in my head and I got to figure it out on my own?
No, there's lots of people that tried to support me, and in their own ways really focused on trying to get me to be better, to succeed in school. I come from a family that's really dedicated to education. Okay. My grandmother spent hours with me early on in my schooling, making sure that I went through my lessons, helping me with my reading and doing all that, and making sure that was great. My mom spent untold hours helping me edit my papers in university because I have great ideas, but when it comes to putting them down, it just becomes jumble. The structure's not there. Right. Me and my mom had a running joke throughout my entire university career of my wall of shame quotes. And it was were sentences that I put into essays that were just the worst, worst grammatically, but really funny if you read them. Cool, and cool. My mom spent so much time with me sitting through that and doing that. And then on the other side, my dad struggled with dyslexia, and he became successful in his own right. So there was always a model that you could get over it, and there was real support in the ways that matter. Just sitting with there and having people present in the struggle, if I could describe it.
Yeah, it sounds like having that model really helped, and then obviously a lot of support and people willing to work with you for your success is definitely an important part in dealing with something like that. And it all starts with you to say that you can do it, and then all the support will help. So talk to us a little bit about kind of that journey into teachers college, right? So did you already know in high school that that's what you were going to do, or was it like a little bit later on, or what was that process like?
Actually, it was the second year of university, or after first year, that I figured out teaching was something I was going to go into. Okay. Pretty much, I will be honest in this moment that most of my plan to high school was just to get into university, because I didn't think I was going to make it by the way that I was performing going into grade 12. By that point, I failed math, had to retake it again. Had an English grade of 60%. So this is grade 11, one more year. Luckily in grade 12, had a great English teacher that actually let me take a lot of my tests orally, so I could just talk about some of my written tests. So that boosted my grade. Got into university, was just thrilled to get in there. I got at York, and then I discovered that you could do a concurrent program. So you could do your undergraduate at the same time as your teacher's college. And I was like, well, if I'm going to be here, might as well go for the 2-for-1 deal, right? It's about the same price. I had been doing camp counseling, and I had been working with youth at that point for a good amount of time. So teaching just made sense. Right. So I just kind of hopped on that, going in that direction. And also, it can make a difference. So that's why I went into teaching at that point.
Can we walk back a little bit to that part where you just said, "Oh, I got into university," right? Because you mentioned that your grades weren't that great, and it must have been a challenging time. But that's probably true for a lot of folks out there, right? Where
Yeah.
they may not have the best scores. But what is that kind of mindset or that process like to kind of pick and choose programs or get into? Like, what was that experience?
Oh no, that was actually I would say that was the worst process ever. I don't recommend you do it my way. My way was just I would honestly describe it as just a mad dash for desperation. Of just I applied everywhere.
Okay.
I just looked at it as the philosophy of I didn't consider myself at that time good enough to be picky.
Okay.
So stage one was just get in, and once I got in during the first year, I was going to be the best student that ever existed. That was just the battle plan. That was just how I was going into it, and that was pretty much my approach. It was, and I kind of go with it. And I think I take that forward into many other things that I do. Is sometimes that half the game is just getting into the league,
Right.
and then after that is put your effort in, and where you start is where you start. Where you end up is completely dependent on what you want to go for. So I would personally, I applied everywhere. I did not expect to get into my first pick universities, but by the end of grade 12, I was actually in decent standing. So everything I applied for, I pretty much got into. That was mind blowing to me. I didn't understand that would be a concept or a possibility, but that's kind of what happened. And I chose York University and their history program because I loved history at the time, and it was the largest history program in Canada. So those two things seemed to be a great pick.
So I guess when you're at that point where now you have actually choices and options, you didn't really, well, were you thinking about what you were going to do with your degree afterwards? Because teaching wasn't on the horizon yet. You're just like,
Nope.
okay, now I have options, and I pick history because whatever, or you didn't have a game plan afterwards, I guess.
No, at that point I was pretty much going, I like history, I can excel in history, so I might as well just play to my strength.
Okay.
And that's kind of a point that I really like to bring with me for everything is sometimes it's about just excelling in the thing that you're good at in a way that the world recognizes. So I don't mean just, give up everything just because you want to be good at X. It's more of, I really enjoyed history. I could be good at history. There's now a history degree. What I was going to do with that after the fact when I was done wasn't as important as if I did good at it, people would recognize it for, well, you're good at history. I assume that you're good at writing. I assume that you're good at reading and research and all these things that were weaknesses that now just get blended over into the melee of, well, now you're qualified. And because of that, I just focused on doing the best where I was. I didn't focus on the grand plan because being great at where I was starting was so much more important than grand strategy at this point in life.
That's amazing. A book title comes to mind. The book's called "So Good They Can't Ignore You." It seems like the whole premise behind that. But if you're to kind of walk us through, so now you've made a decision to go into teachers college and you're going through the process of that. What was the thought afterwards? Like, were you planning on going into teaching kids, and then somehow you got into like disaster management? What is that process like? Okay,
so that process is also a cool process, I guess. Pretty much by to York University teaching. Doing my practicums. Okay. And during about third through fourth year, I got it in my mind that, I need to wean off the supports from being dyslexic. I wanted to distance myself from the concept of it, which meant that I wanted to do things without the supports, without the help, without all this stuff. And at that point, I went to one of the editing programs at York, and somebody who's well-natured or well-meaning, I think, with the comment, pretty much said something along the lines of, why are you being so hard on yourself? Your people need you. And this was a weird moment that changed for me, because up until that point, I had only been sent to poor underprivileged schools in Jane and Finch to teach under the assumption of just, well, this community needs you as a role model. And by you being there, you'll uplift these people.
Okay.
But then as I started teaching, the problem that I started facing is it started not mattering how good of a teacher I was.
Oh.
I will remember a student said to me, well, sir, I don't need to go to university or college or anything because, I'm going to become a crane operator and I'll make more money than you ever will. And I was like, you have a point, but you're also missing the point of what this structural problem is here. What you have is environments where no matter how or academically driven some students are, they might get streamed to something else. And you as the teacher they're kind of facilitating the streaming. And I didn't like this. I didn't like this concept. I didn't associate positively with this feeling of pseudo just is streaming people down certain life paths, which limit them from exploring whatever full potential of what their life could be. Of them choosing so many other options, and not just the few options that they had in these few underprivileged schools that I was constantly stuck at or sent into. And at that moment, I started trying to figure out, okay, I need to do something else other than teaching. I'm going to graduate with this teaching degree. I don't care for the education system as it stands. I need to find the spot that will allow me to have the most impact.
Mm-hmm.
And, more I thought about it and like, well, during normal times, making structural change is very difficult. It's really challenging to get everybody to agree on what change should look like, what betterment is, what all this stuff does. And I was like, where this doesn't apply? Maybe during disasters. After disaster, you have a great reset for all your social programs, for your education. Maybe that's where I'm going to pour my time and effort into. And so that's pretty much how I transitioned from going, being an educator into doing disaster management. It was that realization that me as the floor classroom teacher is still stuck within a larger structure. And the problem that I was trying to see or struggling to comprehend was that to change these larger structures, you need a completely different vantage point from just being the classroom teacher.
Cool. So what was that process like? So you did some education in that, and I think when we connected, you were like managing some of like the floods that were happening like up north and doing that sort of stuff. And then you transitioned to your learning and development role and some of the armed forces stuff. So walk us through some of those intricacies as well.
So that's another great side quest of me. So yes, when we first met, I was with the Ministry of Education doing disaster management, and there had been some floods in the northern community, mostly First Nations communities, and they were being evacuated further south to Kapuskasing and Thunder Bay area, and they needed educational support. So I was involved in working with some of those communities and helping with or assisting my team as an emergency management assistant, get these students to classrooms, working with their agreements and working on continuity of operations for the ministry side. But behind that was the reality that I was on contract to contract. At the time, I was plotting on getting married. So I ended up switching over back to my learning and development side to secure a permanent position. What I ended up switching over on that learning development side was into the world of digital media and digital development for learning. And the reason, and these themes completely out of the blue and really random, but when I started my first summer contract as a summer student, at the time I was still finishing off my Master's of Disaster Management at the University of Newcastle in Australia, doing it through correspondence, so that's how I was here. So my first project with the Ministry of Education in disaster management was the development of emergency management videos. And this was the development of videos for staff to know what to do when There's a fire evacuation for physical security and just protocols during the different alarms for a building lockdown. And it was a video project. So brought in film studios, got to work with filming and editing equipment and got to do all that. So by the time I transitioned from disaster management into my learning and development side, I had all these artistic skills. I could use Photoshop. I could do Premiere editing. I could do video camera setups and lighting. So I ended up with this weird set of skills, but I'm an educator and a disaster manager, which actually is about how do you get people to learn on one side and what is the process? And with those two areas, it just started flowing into all this other corporate side and looking at how to get people through their trades, how to get staff to better engage with communities, which is still technically disaster management in my mind. It's not a flood. It's now the crisis of what do people do when they're unemployed. That's just the crisis that I switched towards looking at.
And is this area kind of what you expected to be? Because you had this revelation that, hey, when there's a disaster, I could kind of impact all this change because, well, like it's all a reset and all that sort of stuff. Did it kind of meet the expectations that you wanted or had in mind when you were making that switch?
So far, not yet, in the sense that I don't think I've actually found that spot yet.
Okay.
That you can do some of the grand thinking that, I like to think about in my free time or when you watch the news or something. I don't think I've found that spot, but I'm glad I haven't found that spot, because I feel like if I found that spot, I'd kind of just sit there and, become kind of stale. But because I don't know where that spot is, I don't know what that looks like, I don't know actually fully how you do some of that stuff. I get to go on this really interesting adventure that touches on so many areas of just life.
Yeah, I think I want to have you back to talk a little bit more about kind of that education system. So if you had like a clean slate and you could build it exactly how you wanted it, what might that look like? And maybe you can give us a bit of a preview, and then we can kind of do a more deeper dive later on.
Well, that's a big question. I think I'm going to leave that for another episode, because I think I'd go off onto the philosophy of education. Is it induction versus exploration? Okay. And then from there, go into an idea of the problem with education would be, what is the nature of our labor market? And what does that mean? And so I think I'd go off on a way too large tangent. I will definitely come back for that.
Yeah, and that's the stuff I'd probably geek out with you on anyway. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. So take us more back into, okay, you're learning and development now, and then the armed forces or the reserves.
Pretty much as I started doing more and more things that are learning development side, more focused on being creative and doing that, I started feeling missing of some of the disaster management activities, or what I feel are some of the cool disaster management activities. I kind of miss the quote unquote the excitement, the nothing's happening, then all of a sudden there's a flood, or oh no, one of the buildings are having evacuation, there's a fire alert, and coordinating this stuff and looking at the physical security and how do you deal with all these cool intricacies. And pretty much that brought me to decide that, pretty energetic, have a good amount of energy. So, the reserves work out to approximately, or on web pages, to 4 days during the week and 1 week in a month. And I was like, you know what, I can spare 4 days a week and a week in a month. It's something I'm interested in. It's something that I wouldn't really consider work that much, because, I just want to show up. I really want to be involved. I want to learn, and I want to be back in that world. So I signed up as a non-commissioned member to do HR, okay, which is something that not many people think of as the first pick when they think of joining the Army. But this is something that I feel that a lot of people should know about, and a lot of people should have the opportunity to explore. there are great accounting positions. There are great HR positions. There are great computer administration positions. In addition to the combat arms of artillery, armored drivers, or infantrymen, there's a whole plethora of jobs that exist, and they're always looking for people. So often, if you wanted an interesting start, yeah, you could go in that direction, gain all these skills, and transition to the regular labor market because they're looking for people. You just have to enjoy that environment and be eager to be there. But that's kind of where I went that direction. And after doing 2 years as being an HR, a human resources administrator with my unit, I decided, or an opportunity really came up for a logistics officer position, to which I was like, oh man, I think I could do that. I have some of the knowledge. I've done it similar on the government side. Why don't I try out for doing that? And that's kind of how that journey went. It's pretty much, it's something that I personally am passionate about. I do enjoy disaster response, and especially with this COVID environment, it's great. I'm a big history lover. I love military history. So it's a whole bunch of things that come together to be what I would describe as a job that I'm always eager to do. And it's nearly a nice separation from the other stuff that I do. It's a little bit of difference. And it keeps you in good shape because you have to exercise. So it's my gym membership too.
That's amazing. Sounds like that's probably another episode, because I'm curious about like, what is it actually about? Because a lot of people hear about joining the army and the armed forces and stuff like that, but to actually get now it's still the reserve. It's not kind of the full-on deployment type of thing.
Yeah,
but it's probably a good taste.
Like the regular, it's not like the regular force army. It's different in that sense, in the sense that you're part-time. There are full-time opportunities there. That is an option, but it's a good place to develop skills, and it's a great place to learn. Definitely.
Sounds good. So as we kind of wrap up, I would love if you could share any additional SWIKE, the stuff you wish you knew earlier. We went through a lot of it during your kind of journey, but are there any kind of topical ones that I'm really passionate about this, and folks need to learn or know this?
I think the biggest one that I think people need to learn, or that I would think of, is actually, I don't know how to put it into exact words. I'd say it's perspective. And the reason why I say this is, I'll tell you the story to it, then I'll go into it. When I was preparing for this interview and I really thought about it, I realized everything that I've done, quote unquote, or so far, that would be described in the realm of what people would consider like successful or going in a career and all that stuff, really done in the last 10 to 15 years, maybe. I've made real decisions about it. Prior to that, I don't think I had any concept of what this was. Okay. And then I started thinking like, man, I just passed over the line towards 32. That means in theory, if I'm going to live, until 90, let's say, that sounds good. And at that point, I don't want to work anymore, right? Sure. So I have another 60 years of this, but everything I've done is only the last 10 years. That means two really interesting things that are so cool to me. One is that I can reinvent myself 6 more times and have the same life that I have right now. Yeah. Which is such a cool backdrop to think. And, each time it's going to get faster because you have all this experience now. So right. You can be 6 other yous, right, doing whatever you want. You can define what that you is. And the other one that's a little bit more negative is that it's finite. So there is a cutoff. So I think that the big thing that I wish I knew earlier is that life is long and short at the same time, but you have so many chances to try new things, and you don't always necessarily need to rush it. So that's one thing that I think definitely I wish I knew.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing perspective, and one that everyone, or as many people can should adopt, because you're right. It is finite, but you can accomplish so much in a decade, in 6 decades, and however many decades you have left. There's so many amazing things that you can accomplish. Are there any other pieces of SWIKE? Otherwise, where can folks connect with you or reach out if they're willing to find out a little bit more?
I'm always available on LinkedIn, so you can definitely reach out to me that way. Just click on a little message board and type away. I might be slow sometimes, but I tend to be pretty good at responding. And through that, I'm always happy to set up Zoom calls or Skype calls and talk if anybody definitely wants any perspectives or opinions or ideas or thoughts. I'm always happy to give out thoughts. Have lots of them. Not all of them are great. Some of them aren't that great. So buyer be warned. But yeah, that's where I definitely would be available.
Sounds good. And some of them might go on that wall of shame type of thing.
Yeah, sometimes, you know.
But at the end of the day, I'm sure people will learn a lot. So thanks so much, Michael, for joining us, and we're looking forward to having you back in a future episode.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for joining us on the SWIKE Stuff I Wish I Knew Earlier, the podcast. If you like the podcast, please subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you found this podcast. And if you can give us a review, that would be very appreciated. Feel free to contact me on LinkedIn at Luki Danu, LUKIDANU, and the same on most social media platforms. And I look forward to hearing from you. Thanks. Bye.